I could just get started now. So welcome to everybody. We are Colorado MUFON.
Colorado MUFON.
Colorado MUFON. And this is our monthly meeting. We have our meetings the second Saturday of every month. I wanted to start out with a volunteer position open for all of you Colorado MUFON members. I have a opening for somebody who would be interested in putting together our Colorado monthly newsletter. I have the program and graphics for you to use. It would be a position where you're just kind of adding material and getting it to us. So if you're interested in that newsletter position, please send me an email or Jeff an email. And I should put up my email for everybody, or I can share it in the chat box. So that's number one. If anybody's interested in that, please let me know. I'll put my email address in the chat box, or you can contact me at katiegroboski.com. My contact information is there as well. Colorado MUFON, as you all know, we probably all found the link to the Zoom meeting on our website. Our website is a good place to check on, who we have as guest speakers coming up, when our meetings are, and also there's a link there to join Colorado MUFON. It's $25 a year, and that's how we afford to bring in speakers. Since this year we're going to be bringing in speakers in person, that helps with rental space and venues and whatnot. And speaking of upcoming guest speakers, we are 99% sure that for next month, June 12th, our guest speaker will be David Marler. David will be, as many of you know, David was just fortunate enough to get a lot of the NICAP and CUFOS documents and has been updating his triangle craft research. Is that correct, Barry? So he will hopefully be giving us an updated presentation on the triangular craft phenomenon on June 12th.
He's doing some with his audio. He was on Facebook. He's doing some with his audio or something like that, I think.
Yep, that's right.
Well, he's digitizing some older audio archival recordings, but he's going through some more historical, relatively unknown triangle sightings from the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah, so that'll be a pleasure. I think we'll be one of the first groups to hear his updated research on that. So look for that next month. And now what I'm really excited to announce, July 10th, the second Saturday of July, I have secured a pavilion at the Bellevue Park, or I always known it as Space Park. And we are going to be hosting a welcome back Colorado MUFON social picnic. So we're going to have people bring blankets and chairs and food, and there's 2 barbecue grills. There's bathrooms there. There's water fountains. We'll have waters to bring. I'm going to share all the information with you guys as the event gets sooner, but we're going to just have an outdoor. I thought since COVID, being outdoors is going to be safer. Bring your Frisbees, bring your balls and gloves, and we're just going to have a great welcome back, being together in person again in July. So I'm super, super excited about having everybody come together. And for those of you who live out of state or can only come by Zoom, I'm going to have the picnic via Zoom so we can all talk and have you guys included too if you want to be there via Zoom. Kevin, if you want to join our picnic in the park, we will be there and we'll come up to the screen and talk to you all. Hello, that kind of thing. I'm so excited.
I might just show up in person.
Yo, that would be fabulous. So mark your calendars for that. I'm super excited.
Katie,
that'll be July 10th, the second Saturday of July, the Welcome Back MUFON picnic out at Bellevue Park. So we have a pavilion.
Trying to make it there in person.
Yeah, we have a limit of 50 for COVID, but that park is so big. There's the little river. If you guys show up and have your blankets out away from the pavilion, I don't think they're going to have a head count. So everybody's welcome to that picnic. It's going to be a great time, and I'm so excited about it. Let's see, what other announcements do I have? Oh, I wanted to say that the registration's open for the symposium in Las Vegas at the JW Marriott, August 27th through the 29th. Colorado has a big group going out. So I hope you all can join us out there in Las Vegas. It's not that far of a drive. Join us. It's going to be a great, great time out there. And if you haven't been to the JW Marriott, it's off the strip, which I love. I'm not a big gambler strip person. So it's off the strip. There's beautiful water fountains. There'll be air conditioning. And it's just a beautiful venue. It's just, if you need a vacation, join us. It's going to be a great time. I think Jeff had a little update on kind of where Colorado is for our cases. And then Jeremy had a couple field investigator announcements, and then we'll introduce our guest speaker.
Okay, hi, everybody. I am Jeff Hastings, the ASD for Colorado. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because there's another panel up there. I'm going to try to share my screen here. And if we can get everybody, oh, it won't let me share my screen, but that's okay. If we can get everybody to mute their microphones, that would be great. So what I did is I took a look at the last 90 days, because trying to look at the last 30 days gets kind of slim on numbers. So in the last 90 days, we've had 46 new reported cases come into Colorado. Currently, we have 11 open. And I'll get back to that 11 open here in a minute. That's how many we have open that have been assigned to other people. There's a person named Steve. If you could mute your microphone, that would be great. And in the last 90 days, we have closed 35 cases, okay? Again, you got to put a big asterisk by these, and I'll get to why and at the end. Of the 35, 25 were IFO. We were able to figure out what 25 of them were. Unfortunately, 4 of the 35 were hoaxes, and we saw through that. 3 were information only. And typically an information only is it's a historical case. I mean, you can't find any corroborating witnesses. They're tough, but we don't want to call them hoaxes. And we don't want to just ignore them or give them an unknown status. So they're out there for information only. And then we had 3 unknowns. We couldn't figure out what they were. And these were good unknowns. I took a look at the cases. We didn't have any cases of interest. I think MUFON changed on CMS the cases of interest where they used to be white. That, or we've just had a really boring last 90 days. Special note, and this has to do with a program within MUFON called Rapid Investigation and Disposition for Repetitive Cases. And what this used to be for primarily was for serial hoaxers. I mean, we get people that, they change their names, they come up with a new story and they shoot it in. That's what it used to be for. Now it's used for Starlink. And I got to tell you, the last 2 days, I think I personally, and what this program is for state directors and assistant state directors to kind of nip this stuff in the bud. And in the last 24, 36 hours, I think I've caught and closed using this program between 8 and 10 cases. I've lost count. I did 2 this morning. So anyway, that's basically it for the last 90 days.
Thank you, Jeff. It amazes me because when you go to put in a report at MUFON, it says right there, if you've seen this, don't report it, but they're still coming in. So thank you, Jeff, for handling the Starlink cases. That's it's a pain in the butt, quite frankly. And I was fortunate enough to see those for the first time. They are an amazing site. Seemed like they just went on forever, kind of out by DIA. It was really cool. If you haven't seen Starlink, get out there. You can go to Heavens Above and see where they're going to be. It's really cool to see those go by, for sure.
And what I actually did is when I got the first one, I knew there'd be more. So I wrote down all the times that it was going to pass over Colorado. So whenever a case would come in, I'd just check the time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Jeremy, would you like to give the F5s those couple of reminders that I had?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm My name is Jeremy Ray, and I'm the Chief Investigator for Colorado MUFON. I'd just like to introduce myself. There's some people here I've never met before, so welcome to the meeting. Let me get the dates here. So this is for Colorado field investigators. I'd just like to remind everybody that's Colorado FIs that we will have our next Zoom meeting on Tuesday, May the 25th at 7:00 p.m. We'll try to shoot for 40 minutes to an hour, but we kind of all agreed that Tuesday would work for everybody, but we can, next month, if this doesn't work for some field investigators, we can try to adjust the schedule for everybody. So I just want to put that out there. And our field investigator training / Skywatch Day will be Saturday, June the 19th. Now the details and schedule for that day will be emailed out to all field investigators very soon. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be out at Paul Ogle's land, and I'm looking forward to being there, and I invite everybody to come. It's going to be a great event.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yes, ma'am.
And thank you, Jeff. And now to the good stuff. All right, our guest speaker today is Preston Dennett, and I'm going to read his bio. Real quick too, I would like to also mention the Laughlin UFO Mega Conference out in Laughlin, Nevada, June 6th through the 12th. Next month, Preston will be speaking there. I'll be speaking there as well. As I think there's 32 or 36 other speakers. It's a week-long event. So, if you need another vacation, come on out to Laughlin. That'll be a lot of fun. So Preston Dennett.
May I jump in just for a second? I was going to surprise Katie and show up at that conference. I was going to keep it secret, right? And then my job said, we have to cancel your vacation for the summer. And I was super upset. Remember that, Katie?
Yeah,
I said I wasn't going to make it.
Don't quit your job for me, Jeremy.
No, I raised a little hell. I'm going to be there. So
Good.
I will be there.
That's awesome. Okay, so Preston Dennett, our guest speaker for today, he began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and coworkers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomenon. He is a field investigator for MUFON, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 26 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. Several of his books have been Amazon UFO bestsellers. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines, including Fate, Atlantis Rising, the MUFON Journal, Nexus, Paranormal Magazine, UFO Magazine, Phenomenon Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, Ufologist, and others. Hold on. Sorry about that. His writing has been translated into several different languages, including German, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Icelandic. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and also the History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters. His research has been presented in the LA Times, the LA Daily News, the Dallas Morning News, and other newspapers. He has taught classes on various paranormal subjects and lectures across the United States. He currently resides in Southern California. Please let's give a big Colorado MUFON welcome to our guest speaker today, Preston Dennett. Welcome, Preston.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks. Yeah, I'm excited. All right, are we ready to go?
We are ready.
All right, so just a reminder, how long do I have to couldn't hear you.
Technically, we go until 4 o'clock, so you have a lot of time.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, awesome.
And if we end early, that's okay too.
All right, I'm just gonna share screen then. And
Preston, just add that's 4 p.m. Mountain Time.
Oh yeah, right. Thank you, Barry.
You're in California.
All right, that's 3 p.m. for me, I think.
Yep.
So we're good because I have a tendency to run over sometimes. All right, I'm just gonna share screen. Host, you have to let me share the screen.
All right. Jeff, that's you. So you'll just click on Preston's that little button in his upper right-hand corner, because I made you the host, Jeff. So if you can give him permission.
Katie, I'm not the host.
You're not the host.
No.
It says that you are. Make
No.
host. I'm gonna make you host, Dennett, Preston, and then you should be able to share.
That's what I did last month.
Okay. Are you able to share now, Preston?
Yes,
Okay,
there we go.
Perfect.
All right.
I'm gonna go ahead and mute.
Okay. Can you hear me? Are we good? Yep. Awesome. All right. First of all, I want to thank you all. I'm super excited about this. This is a picture of Colorado. Like I said, Colorado is the most beautiful state I've ever visited. And yeah, today I want to talk about what I think are the top 20 cases in Colorado. I wrote a book about this state. Written books about a number of states, kind of like in the style of a history book, because I really want this subject to be taken more seriously. I want it to be pushed into the mainstream, and I'm very happy to see that this is finally happening. So let's just get right into it, because I've got a lot of information to share. And the top 20 cases I picked were very difficult to choose from, because there are so many really excellent cases coming from Colorado, but I picked the ones that I think are the best verified or have something unique to contribute to our understanding of the UFO phenomena, or were well publicized, but I'm sure there are some cases in here you've never heard of. And yeah, it was a difficult choice for sure. So let's just get started. Yeah, I became interested in UFOs in 1986, was very skeptical, but heard a report on the news about a sighting over Alaska. Started asking my family and friends and coworkers, and found out a lot of them had seen UFOs. Some had very dramatic encounters. So I was sort of dragged into this field kicking and screaming, but ultimately I'm really happy about it. It's really changed my life. These are all the UFO books I've written. I'm at like book number 28 now. So I think this is a really important subject. And I think that everyone should know UFOs are real. And that's why I'm continuing to investigate this phenomena. So here's the book I wrote, UFOs Over Colorado. I dug real deep into various UFO organizations, contacted a bunch of UFO researchers, got some original cases of my own. And let's just start digging into what I think are the top 20 Colorado cases. And just going to do a countdown from 20 going to number 1. And the case I chose for number 20 is a really early sighting, which occurred on September 7th, 1917. And this is in the town of Salida, actually. And what I love about this case, this occurred in the first week of September 1917, is that this is really so early that it was, I mean, airplanes had just been invented, like what, 20 years earlier or so. And on September 7th, 1917, according to the Salida record, numerous witnesses throughout Salida saw what they called strange, quote, vehicles of the air. And this was appearing on a nightly basis. Many people in the whole town saw it. It was hovering mostly over Tenderfoot Mountain and also over Mount Shivano. And what's a lot of really good witnesses. Some of the witnesses were Reverend and Mrs. Oakley. They observed this object through a telescope, actually. But many people saw it, the Woody family, the Bode family, many residents of Salida. And the article in the Salida record discounted the possibility that this might have been an airplane, because the description of the object just didn't match an airplane. So it's a very early case, predating the modern age of UFOs, and that's why I chose it as the top 20 case. And now for case number 19, I chose what I believe to be Colorado's first UFO photo. And this occurred in the town of Ward, Colorado. This was back in April of 1929. And this comes from a lady by the name of Hetty Pline. Her father, Edward, came home one day. He worked at the sawmill in Ward and said that he was at this sawmill when there was a very loud noise coming from overhead. How he described it was a terrible, thunderous bellow. And there was a very large round thing, which he was about as big as a boulder, moving over the air above them. And he had a camera ready, so he quickly took a picture. They did not see this thing, but it did appear in the photo. And it was so loud that it made the actual ground shudder. So as you can see, it's very low, treetop level. And as this photo shows, it's sort of your classic disc with little, what appear to be lights around it. And Hetty, Edward's daughter, did try to research the incident years later and locate the other workers, but was unable to find any of them. Too many years had passed. But it's a very interesting photo, to say the least. And yeah, as far as I know, it's the first UFO photo ever taken in Colorado.
Zoom.
All right, and now we move to case number 18, which is a report from Cheyenne Mountain. This occurred in May 1970. And this case comes from NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center. And this is a very interesting case. As you may know, Cheyenne Mountain is an underground military complex, which is used to protect the security of the United States. They track all the air traffic coming in and out of the US. And this report comes from a new employee at Cheyenne Mountain. He was working the night shift, monitoring the radar stations. And it was the third weekend in May of 1970 when a bunch of reports came in of these objects, 4 objects traveling at an altitude of about 25,000 feet and moving in excess of 2,500 miles per hour, far in excess of anything we have, certainly. Coming down over the Bering Sea, down the coast of Alaska, and down to British Columbia. Jet fighters were launched from Alaska to try and chase and intercept these objects. And by the time they weren't able to catch up to it, and by the time these objects reached Vancouver, they moved straight up and out of range of the radar scopes. And this really impressed this new worker, and it turned out this was not unique. This happened fairly regularly, he found out. There was a bunch of other sightings in April, and he found out, yeah, that this was a regular thing. And as he says, and I'd just like to give you a short quote, "All the old timers who were mostly radar techs and former radar techs let me in on the secret. This kind of thing happened all the time, but you learned to never report it in any written reports and to never question it." And it was many years later, he decided to report it to NUFORC, and he wrote, "I have never reported this to anyone or put this in writing before, knowing that the truth will never be out there in print." Well, it's out there now. And what I find interesting about this report is that this is a regular event. And I am fairly confident it's still going on right now. So the next case I'd like to share is case 17, and that involves a state senator who saw a UFO on November 25th, 1955. This is Colorado State Senator Sam T. Taylor, and he was in the town of La Veta, when he observed a dirigible-shaped object. It was glowing. At first, he thought it was actually a shooting star because it was swooping down at a very high speed, but he quickly realized it could not be a shooting star when at about a level of 15,000 feet, he's estimating, it leveled off and went at a level trajectory for a slight time over Mount Mestis, and then it took off straight upwards. It was in view for only about 5 seconds, but certainly long enough for him to conclude that this was not any normal type of aircraft or not a shooting star. It was totally silent, had almost a weird gelatinous appearance is how he described it. But he reported it to the FBI, and this was rooted to Project Blue Book. And Blue Book officers investigated the case and were not able to identify it. It's case number 3869 in Project Blue Book. And what I like about this case is that it was viewed by a state senator. There are a number of people in high levels of government who have observed UFOs. And Senator Russell of Virginia, of course, Fife Symington, former governor of Arizona, and a number of other representatives, and well, we have even presidents as well. So that's why I wanted to include this case, because of the credibility of the witness. And now I want to move to case number 16, which is another Blue Book unidentified case, case number 5852, June 14th, 1958. This occurred at around 10:46 a.m. The witness was an airport weather observer, a meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau. His name is Orville R. Foster, and he was on duty actually at Pueblo Memorial Airport. And he was observing the weather, a weather balloon through a theodolite. A theodolite is a telescope that's attached to a device to measure angles, which allows the observer to sort of triangulate the weather balloons that they're observing. And to his amazement, he saw this weird object enter the field of the lens. It was a silver white object, he said, Saturn shaped, tilted forward. And he estimates that it was at least 30 feet in diameter and moving at about 500 miles per hour. He watched it for over 5 minutes through the theodolite as it traveled from horizon to horizon. And it was definitely not a balloon, certainly not the balloon he was observing. It's a very interesting case. What I like about it is it was viewed by a trained observer through a theodolite, and Blue Book officers were also unable to identify it. And it is one of few cases in Colorado which Blue Book officers were not able to identify. All right, case number 15. I chose a very early case involving a humanoid sighting. There are almost no humanoid cases cited before the modern age of UFOs in 1947. So I thought this one was really significant. And this occurred, in 1931, the winter of 1931, in the town of Holyoke. And I'll just quote the witness directly. He was a rancher about 8 miles southwest of Holyoke. And as he says, in the winter of 1931, I saw a flying machine as I was riding on a horse in a draw of pasture. I was 17 and I was checking on cattle after a snowstorm. I went over a small hill and down to a draw that was about 25 feet deep. I looked up to the west and saw an elongated oval-shaped object, a flying machine, in the air. It was aluminum in color and had a door that was transparent, like glass. He looks through this door, and as he says, a man appeared that looked human, but was not as tall. He looked down at me, and he had a uniform on that was darker than he was. As he was watching this humanoid, his horse stumbled and he looked away. And when he looked back up, the UFO was gone. And it was more than 70 years later in 2004 when he was inspired to report his account to the National UFO Reporting Center. Peter Davenport, who's the director of NUFORC, talked to him directly. And as Peter Davenport says, "We spoke with the witness at length, and he seemed to be an exceptionally reliable and credible witness." So yeah, I love this case because it's such an early case involving a humanoid sighting. And now we move to case number 14. I found this one really incredible because I started looking into cases involving UFOs that hover over prisons. And I have to tell you, I found 20 or 30 of them. And I found that Colorado prison has been visited on 4 separate occasions over the years. As you can see, 65, 67, 76, and 1998. I'm fairly confident because of this track record that it will be visited again. UFOs do seem to be interested in their, installations, such as nuclear power stations and Air Force bases. I think that's what attracted UFOs to Colorado prison. But the first case I found was August 2nd, 1965. This was during a huge nationwide wave of UFO sightings when 2 of the tower guards saw something they weren't able to explain. One of the guards, his name was Donald Stites. This was in the wee hours of the morning, 2:15 a.m., and this object was hovering near the prison between Colorado Springs and Pueblo, he says. And it appeared to be this glowing white object, which remained stationary in the sky, but was dimming and brightening. And after about 30 minutes, it suddenly winked out. Another case comes from a gentleman who's anonymous. I believe this was reported to MUFON. And this occurred in September of 1967 when 3 guys were camping in Crestone, and they saw this large fireball descending down, and at around 30,000 feet altitude, it broke into 3 objects, one of which came swooping down towards them and scared the daylights out of them because it was getting closer and closer, when it suddenly made a 90-degree turn, and clearly not a meteorite, and headed over across the San Luis Valley and over the mountains towards Colorado prison. And they thought at first they were the only witnesses until they found a newspaper article the next day describing this amazing sighting, which was apparently viewed by the Colorado Highway Patrol. And these 3 lights were hovering over the Colorado prison on the east side of the Crestone Mountains. And these police officers chased these objects for more than 2 hours. The prison guards actually were fearing a prison break and called in off-duty guards. Colorado Highway Patrol notified Peterson Air Force Base, who were able to locate this object on their radar scopes. And they launched 2 F-106 interceptors who approached the objects and asked for permission to fire upon them, at which point 3 objects accelerated away at high speed. The F-106s tried to follow them, but could not keep up. So it's a pretty amazing case involving a lot of witnesses, and again, hovering over Colorado prison. It's very strange. Another case occurred in August of 1976, when a correctional officer at Colorado prison saw an oval-shaped disc. It was 100 feet in diameter, hovering over the nearby mountains. It was about 200 yards away from him, close enough where he could hear a low-pitched humming sound. It was moving very slowly at about 20 miles per hour. And he marked it down in the log and reported it to the local police department. And not only affected him, emotionally. He was actually physically affected by it. He had some physiological reactions. He was very disoriented by the sighting and had very poor sleeping for the next 2 weeks following the sighting. So apparently he did have some physiological reactions from this object. And the most recent case I found over this prison occurred on January 10th, 1998. And again, this involved a correctional officer and some of the inmates, actually. The correctional officer was taking a crew of inmates back to the tool shop to return all the tools. And one of the prison inmates looked up and saw, quote, a very large sphere, chrome in color, with 3 brown spots on the side. It was pretty high up there, so many thousands of feet high, but appeared to be huge. They estimate that it was probably about the size of 10 full-size airliners. And as the correctional officer says, and I quote, the inmate and I just looked at each other and said, what in the hell is that? To this day, I have no idea what it was. Yeah, I love this case because I think it shows UFOs' tendency to hover over powerful installations. And I can only imagine what they thought of, this prison and what its purpose was. But it's definitely a thing. UFOs are hovering over prisons all across the United States and the world. Next case I want to talk about, I chose for number 13, is a massive wave which occurred over the city of Denver on August 9th, 1965. Here's a photo of Denver circa this year. And this wave sort of came to the attention of investigators when the local newspapers started receiving a flood of calls. The Denver Post began around 5:50 p.m. when a teenager by the name of Bill Lamberton was driving with 2 passengers down Mississippi Avenue when he saw a cylindrical shaped object hovering momentarily, and it darted westward over the mountains. He says the object was in view for about 6 seconds. And this was just the first sighting. These UFOs kept coming back and flying over the city. Next sighting occurred at 9:15 p.m. when Randy Holmes, another teenager, saw a bright yellow cigar-shaped object moving over the horizon, and he watched it from his residence on Everett Street. 40 minutes later, Don Storez, age 81, observed it from Greenwood Boulevard. As he says, it was coming from the north at a very high rate of speed and going straight north. It covered 3/4 of the sky in just a few seconds and disappeared in a red glow. By this point, the Denver Post was receiving, their phone was ringing off the hook, reporting sightings. Another report came at 10:05 p.m. Mrs. Osdale said, we picked up a UFO with our binoculars. At first it went to the right, and after a while it came back very fast and stood there for a few minutes. It appeared to be dome-shaped with a red and green light on its edge, like a headlight on a car, and very luminous. Normally, if I hear someone say a red and green light, I think plane. But in this case, it's clearly not a plane if it's hovering in place and has a dome shape and darting very quickly. I think sometimes UFOs mimic planes on purpose. So perhaps that's what was happening in this particular case. But it was just 5 minutes later when Barbara Fisher saw multiple UFOs moving southward over Buckley Field at Buckley Air Force Base. And 15 minutes later, Don Turkins watched an object from his home on Independence Street. He described it as cone-shaped with a dome on top, and the lights changing from yellow to red to green. Was seen 5 minutes later from another witness on Tennyson Street. And this gentleman, his name was Mr. Speaks, he told reporters, my wife and I and our neighbors saw a light over by the North Star, and it disappeared over the mountains towards Boulder. So this sighting just went on and on. Another sighting at 11 p.m. by William McCall and his two daughters. They observed 3 red glowing objects clustered closely together. As he says, they separated and circled over the city from southwest to southeast. And 10 minutes later, the last recorded sighting came in from Vaughn Andel. He was a high school math teacher who was jogging around the school track when he saw this white luminous flash in the south sky. And he says it was considerably larger than any commercial aircraft and was at least the size of the football field I was running around. So the Denver Post, after receiving all these reports, actually contacted the NORAD and the tracking center at Colorado Springs, and a duty officer told them that they had no explanation for the sightings and said, quote, "We're not in the UFO business," which is kind of disingenuous, I think. I'm pretty sure that they were aware of what's going on. They told the Post that they were probably observing the Echo 2 satellite, which is kind of a ridiculous explanation. But what I like about this sighting and why I included it on this list is because this is sort of typical UFO behavior. Normally UFOs are very evasive, but sometimes they put on what are clearly displays, what I think is sort of a publicity stunt to announce their presence and let people know that UFOs are real. So I'm fairly certain that they were showing themselves on purpose, because this is typical of your sort of UFO wave where I think they're announcing their presence. I really do. Next case I want to talk about, case number 12, is a really interesting UFO healing case. I've done a lot of research into UFO healings. I wrote a book about it, which covers some 300 cases of people who've been healed as a result of a UFO encounter. I think UFOs get a lot of bad publicity, but I have to tell you, there is a very benevolent aspect to a lot of encounters. And I've gotten cases of people healed of, you name it, everything from colds to cancer. And that's what happened in this case. A gentleman was suffering from skin cancer. He had several large melanomas, and he was driving through the town of Longmont, Colorado, with his wife. This is on November 19th, 1980. He's an art teacher, and they heard this very loud swishing noise. And at that moment, a bright beam of light came and locked onto their car. The car lights dimmed, the radio failed, and next thing they know, their car is actually being lifted up off the highway. It scared the daylights out of them. Next thing they know, they're back on the highway, and it's now some hours later. It's now 1 a.m., and they quickly drove home. And when they got home, this is when the witness noticed that his melanomas had, quote, been greatly reduced in size and coloration. So they reported their sighting, and this incident was actually investigated by Linda Moulton Howe and Richard Sigismund and other investigators. The witnesses were put under hypnosis, and under hypnosis, they recalled being pulled inside an object, seeing gray-skinned beings, your typical grays. They were wearing shiny gold uniforms. The witnesses were separated and physically examined by a, quote, a floating light. The husband said that the ETs were very interested in his memories and were recording his memories. They gave him various messages, told him that there are multiple dimensions coexisting within our own. They communicated through telepathy, and after just physically examining them, returned them back to their car. This was very traumatic for the witnesses. They did not feel like this was a benevolent encounter, although they were healed. They did report this, as I mentioned, to the CUFOS, the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies. And eventually they stopped cooperating with investigators because recovering these memories was just too traumatic for them. But I find this case interesting because it's one of many in which people have been healed as a result of a UFO encounter. This account appeared in Richard Hall's book, Uninvited Guests, and also appeared in a number of other UFO books. Okay, I love this next case number 11, involving a meteorologist by the name of Robert Rinker. He was a field technician at a weather station on Chalk Mountain. This is a weather station located about 11,000 feet, and Chalk Mountain is near the town of Climax. And Robert Rinker took a photograph, and he saw nothing unusual when he took this photograph. But upon developing it, he was shocked to see this enormous glowing white disc with a dark ring around the circumference. It appears to be hovering less than 100 feet above the ground and covered a good portion of the sky. So it must have been very large and clearly not a mistake on the negative. So a very unusual case, which did appear in the Blue Book files and the Condon Committee files. Yeah, I chose this case because it's an excellent photograph taken over Colorado and has never been debunked. Here's a case I'm guessing you haven't heard about. This comes from researcher Donald Kehoe, and this case did appear in the Condon Committee files, which really surprised Air Force officers as they believed this case had been marked secret. And this occurred on the evening of May 13, 1967, when radar operators at Colorado Springs were shocked to see this blip on their radar scopes. And this was on two separate stations, so we know it wasn't an artifact or a weird echo of birds or something. But what this blip on the radar showed was a very large object approaching Colorado Springs. It was a very solid image, and this object appeared to be at a level of 200 feet. And it was doing an approach very much like an F-100 or an F-104 jet interceptor would do if they were practicing a landing, but not actually touching down. What was very strange is while this object did appear on two separate radar stations, they could not see anything visibly. It was invisible. And this didn't happen once, this happened twice. And as Donald Kehoe writes, and I quote, "According to the radar track, the UFO came to within 1.5 miles of the control tower, but the tower operators could not see it, even with binoculars. To the CU radar expert who investigated this case, this was the most baffling radar case on record. He admitted he could not find an explanation, but for the Air Force, it was far more than puzzling. Their own radar experts had reached the same conclusion. Some unknown high-speed aircraft had maneuvered over the airport absolutely unseen. Could the technically advanced UFO aliens have developed a means for making their spacecraft invisible? It seemed fantastic, but what other answer was there? If true, they could be in serious trouble in case of UFO attacks. This must remain as one of the most puzzling radar cases on record, and no conclusion is possible at this time."
Excuse me for a minute. Excuse me, Preston. Can I please remind everybody if you could please mute your mics? That would be very much appreciated. I'm hearing some background noise. So if you just came on and your mutes or your your microphones are not muted, will you please do that? Thank you so much. All right, sorry for the interruption. Preston, continue.
No worries.
Congratulations, Falls.
All right, I think that sounds better. Thanks, guys, for muting. I appreciate it. All right, so yeah, so this invisible UFO, I mean, we know now, of course, that UFOs are able to turn invisible. Many, many witnesses have called this, but this is one of the first cases involving this. And this case did reach the Condon Committee, and Air Force officers were surprised because they thought it was going to be kept confidential, but it somehow made it in. And the radar expert, Gordon Thayer, who investigated this case for the Condon Committee, had pretty much discounted all the other cases, calling them weather propagations. But this was one case he was never able to explain. And that's why I wanted to include it on this list of sightings. All right, now we're getting closer to the top 10, or the best cases. Case number 9, I chose the Denver Extraterrestrial Affairs Commission. You guys may remember this. This occurred on November 2008 when former candidate Jeff Peckman introduced a referendum into the city of Denver to create a 7-member commission to handle extraterrestrial affairs. This was called Initiative 300, which was aiming for a budget of $75,000, which was entirely dependent on grants and donations. They weren't taking any city funds, and its purpose was to help legitimize the UFO subject and create transparency and cooperation within government, between citizens and government. And he needed about 4,000 signatures to qualify, and he got those very easily. So he submitted the initiative, and on November 2nd, 2010, citizens voted on this initiative, and the results were decidedly one-sided. The number of those voting yes was over 31,000. Quite a few voted yes. Unfortunately, the number of those voting no was in excess of 145,000. So more than 80% of Colorado voters were not persuaded that UFOs deserved their own commission, and this ordinance was defeated, unfortunately. But I love this case because it's one of the first attempts to really bring sort of an official commission to study UFOs officially. That's not through the government itself. So that's why I included it in this list. All right, and now I'm going to move to case number 8, which I am sure you heard of, the case of Stan Romanek. It's certainly a very controversial case, and I think it has detractors and supporters for sure. I will tell you that I did speak with Stan personally for over an hour. I spoke with his wife as well. Oh, someone's not muting. If someone could please mute their microphone, I'd appreciate it.
Since you're hosting, Preston, you do have the ability to mute people if you just click on their names and you can mute them.
Oh,
I think you have the power to do that.
You know, I can't see them though.
Oh, you can. Okay. Please, Steve, mute your mic. Okay.
All right, here.
We will have question and answers at the end of this, so we'll have an opportunity to ask questions.
So yeah, I know Stan Romanek is a controversial case, but I have to tell you, he was a very nice man when I spoke to him, and he's written a couple of books about what happened to him, and I felt like his case was important to cover because it certainly did have a huge impact when it came out. And how it all began was on September 20th, 2001, when Stan was working as an assistant manager at a retail store in Denver. And the store was about to close when people came rushing into the store and said a UFO was hovering overhead. And he went outside and saw a very large glowing sphere was about 30 feet wide and hovering directly over the building. And as soon as he saw it, it shot straight up. This really surprised Stan because this was his third sighting in a year. And it was that evening he went home and had his first abduction experience. People often say that, if they're going to abduct me, why don't aliens just, knock on the front door and ask? Well, that's actually what happened in Stan's case. There was people knocking on the door. He woke up and he found his sister standing in the living room. The door was opened and these weird figures were walking in. His sister remembers this incident. Stan does have a lot of witnesses to support his story, including family and friends, all of whom still support his story, by the way. And this was his first abduction experience. And these three figures walked inside. They were skinny, short, large almond-shaped eyes with large heads. And they led him through the house. He fought with them and fell unconscious and woke up the next morning, but thought it was a dream, but found strange marks on his body, abrasions on his wrists and on his ankles. They fluoresced under a black light. And his sister recalled having a weird dream where three strange men came in through the front door. And it was following this, he began having regular experiences. This is when he started photographing these objects and was able to get a number of very interesting photos. He went under hypnosis, recalled being taken on board into a rounded room where he was physically examined. He was consumed with fear, and the being said, "It's okay, just calm down, we won't hurt you." And he started writing mathematical symbols around this time. He got a lot of messages that there would be future disasters striking our planet. That's certainly something I've heard many times. As he says, he saw, quote, "images of winds so strong, they scoured the roads and highways off the earth, tidal waves covering entire cities. There were fires everywhere. The whole planet seemed to be in convulsions as disaster over disaster overtook it." So Stan started to take some really interesting photos. The two above photos appeared on his camera after having gone missing for 2 weeks, and he had no memory of taking these pictures. If true, these are the first alien selfies that I know of. The below pictures were ones that he did take. And it was then that his case became very controversial and he started getting a lot of detractors. Nevertheless, he continued to have abductions. On one occasion, he had hurt his leg and had to have surgery and woke up and there was these scars on his leg. He went to the doctor and the doctor was amazed because his leg had been apparently healed. He does have some landing trace evidence as well that supports his case. So yeah, it's a very controversial case. One time he was taken, he was returned, he says, wearing a woman's nightie. So I don't know if that was a mistake or not, or if the ETs were playing a joke or what's going on here. He also had an implant removed from his body, which was studied by scientists. The scientists were really impressed because this implant had a type of amino acid surrounding it, which is actually used to coat artificial joints and pacemakers so that the body won't reject them. So yeah, I know it's a controversial case for sure. But when I talked to him, he seemed very sincere. I think one of the reasons it's controversial is because there was an incident where he was apparently caught on videotape throwing a pencil or something and then saying it was moved by itself. And then he was also accused of pornography, which he denies. He says he was being set up, which I wonder about because he wouldn't be the first witness to have been set up. He did receive a number of threats, was being surveilled. But Dwight Connolly, editor of the MUFON Journal, certainly supported this case, and many people still support it. Last I heard, Stan Romanek is in very poor health. He's no longer gone public with his case. But in any case, yeah, he was accused by the Department of Homeland Security of pornography and was found guilty and was sentenced to a halfway house. And yeah, last I heard, he's not doing well. He's in very poor health, but his family is still supporting his case. So that's why I included it, because, you know, whether you believe him or not, this case definitely did have an impact on the UFO field. So case number 7 is another very high impact case, which a lot of people don't know about. And this involves a very unusual lecture, which took place at the University of Colorado on March 8th, 1950. And this was a lecture which was supposed to involve just a few engineering students, but ended up spreading like wildfire, and everyone wanted to come to attend it. This comes from Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers. This is like the first UFO book, and he was the first person to talk about UFO crashes. And at the time, his book was heavily attacked and somewhat debunked. Now, many researchers are taking it much more seriously. And this lecture at the University of Colorado was supposed to involve only 90 science students, but ended up being attended by more than 350 students, as well as a large group of professors, and involved a witness who said that he was involved in a UFO crash recovery, what we now know to be the Aztec UFO crash recovery. The witness was one of the first-hand witnesses, but he backed out. And so the person who actually spoke was Silas Newton. The lecture itself was organized by George Kohler. The first-hand witnesses was Leo Gebauer, and Silas Newton was a Texas oil millionaire who was a friend with Leo Gebauer. And according to Frank Scully, he called Leo Gebauer Dr. G and described this Aztec UFO crash. According to Scully, Dr. G was actually a combination of several of the scientists, but Silas Newton gave the lecture, and he gave the whole story of this flying saucer, which landed about 500 miles from where this lecture actually took place. And according to Leo Gebauer and Silas Newton, this craft held 34 humanoids, each about 3 feet tall with fair complexions, all bald except for a light peach fuzz on their heads. They all had perfect teeth, identical uniforms, and caps with no insignia or markings. There was a thread tested from one of these uniforms, which according to Silas Newton, took 450 pounds of weight before this thread actually broke. I'm sorry, the Aztec craft actually held 16 bodies. And he talked about a number of craft. One craft held only 2 bodies. And the scientists who investigated these humanoids believed that they were extraterrestrial, but did not know their actual origins. They tested the metals within this craft, which were able to withstand 10,000 degrees and were impenetrable using diamond drills. On board the UFO, they found instruments which measured the magnetic force of our planet. So they believed that the craft were actually powered by magnetics, using the magnetic lines coming from our planet itself. The Aztec crash had only one tiny hole in a porthole, and that's apparently what brought it down. It was 99.9 feet in diameter. The smaller craft was 36 feet in diameter. There were no weapons found on board these craft. They did find sleeping quarters, food, and water. The food appeared to be in concentrated pill form, and the water was discovered to be heavy water, meaning it had extra ions in it. There were all kinds of devices that were unidentified. So this is what they were talking about in this UFO lecture. The students were somewhat divided on whether or not this was real, but some thought it was, some thought it wasn't. Silas Newton did write notes on the chalkboard, which have been preserved to this day and appear in the book by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey in their book on this case. And Silas Newton spoke for about 50 minutes and spent 15 minutes answering questions. And despite the promise of no publicity, newspapers did hear about this, and it was all over the newspapers. And whether this is a hoax or not, certainly the government took it very seriously and spared no expense to try and track down who this speaker was. They did eventually identify Silas Newton, at which point he was viciously attacked and debunked and ended up being arrested for fraud. He claims that he was targeted and that he was innocent. And researcher William Steinman actually investigated this case in detail and builds a very compelling argument that Silas Newton was telling the truth after all. And the Aztec crash was at first viciously debunked, but now many researchers such as Timothy Good and Linda Moulton Howe and many others are taking it very seriously. And certainly our own government at the time, we now know, was very interested in what was going on. And they went so far as to track every person who was flying in and out of Colorado at that time in their attempts to locate Silas Newton. So this was one of the first real UFO leaks regarding UFO crashes, and that's why I wanted to include it on this list. For case number 6, I chose the case of Dr. Leo Sprinkle, PhD. Leo Sprinkle is a pioneering UFO researcher, and he was the first person to actually use hypnotic regression to uncover memories from people who have had missing time. And what a lot of people don't know is he's also a contactee himself. Back in the fall of 1949, Leo Sprinkle, whose first name is actually Ronald, and his friend, Joe Wagoner, they were 19 years old, students at the University of Colorado in Boulder, actually saw a flying saucer move right over the campus at very low level. And at the time, Leo Sprinkle thought that, quote, only kooks saw UFOs. So he was really impressed by this sighting, and it shook him up pretty bad enough where he wouldn't talk about it to anybody except his friend Joe, who he saw it with. But he knows one thing for sure, as he says, it wasn't an airplane and it wasn't a balloon. So this sighting was constantly on his mind, but he didn't do anything about it. Then 7 years later, on a summer evening in 1956, he had another sighting, and this really caused a radical shift in his life. As he says, he saw this object moving between them in the Flatirons in the Rocky Mountains. As he says, we watched it for several minutes. It would hover, then move, hover, then move. It had no sound and no features that I could observe. But I knew something unusual was going on because I could hear the honking of the horns below us in Boulder. So he was thinking this would be a big news story. Of course, there was nothing in the newspapers, and this sighting changed Dr. Leo Sprinkle's life. He became utterly convinced UFOs were real and felt that they deserved much greater study. So he decided to get a doctorate in psychology. And as I said, he became one of the first investigators to use hypnosis to uncover memories of amnesia. And he was also really one of the first real scientists to study the subject. There were very few. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Dr. James McDonald, Not a lot of people. Nope, someone needs to mute, please. What I find interesting about Dr. Leo Sprinkle is that he's not only an investigator, he is a contactee himself. And at some point he decided to go under hypnosis. And under hypnosis, he found out that he was visited as a very young kid. And he recalls being taken on board a craft from his home in Rocky Ford. And he recalls looking outside of a porthole and seeing not only stars, but the planet Saturn itself. What I find interesting about this case is I've talked to a number of contactees who've had this exact experience. Could someone please mute? I'm hearing you. Yeah, if you could all just check to see if you're not muted, I'd really appreciate it. So Dr. Leo Sprinkle was taken on board a craft as a kid. I think there are a lot of researchers out there who are actually UFO contactees. This has actually got a name. It's called UFO investigators disease. When Ed Conroy began investigating Whitley Strieber's case, he also started having sightings and was taken on board. So I think once you start investigating this, they investigate you, or they investigate you first, and that gets you interested in UFOs. But yeah, Dr. Leo Sprinkle is an actual contactee who was shown the planet Saturn, which sounds like science fiction, but I know personally at least 3 other people that this has happened to. So that's why I wanted to include that case here. Okay, please mute. Someone's still not muted. So if you could all
Hey,
just...
Paul, is Paul Lugal? You're driving?
Yeah, Paul, you need to mute your mic, sir.
There, I did it. Okay. All right. And now the next case I want to include is the Greeny Mountain UFO incident. This is not very well known. I got this from researcher Christopher O'Brien, who is certainly one of Colorado's most prominent UFO researchers. And this occurred on January 12th, 1994. And I think it's probably the best verified possible or alleged UFO crash in Colorado. This occurred on Greeny Mountain, which is in Colorado, in Rio Grande County. It occurred in around late December 1993, early January 1993. There had been a wave of sightings involving orbs and mysterious sonic booms. And then on January 12th, 1994, a NORAD official called the Rio Grande County Sheriff's Office to report an explosion and a heat source, a signature that they had detected by satellite on the north face of Greeny Mountain. And they told Undersheriff Brian Norton that this heat source wouldn't have registered for anything less than a 3-acre fire. So they asked him to investigate. As Sheriff Brian Norton says, a guy from NORAD told us to expend all efforts to find out what it was. So he drove up there and couldn't find anything. But it turns out there were a lot of sightings going on at this time. Around this time, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Lloyd, he's a retired fighter pilot, a great witness, was driving on State Highway 67, which is about 40 miles east of the San Luis Valley. And he saw a group of 6 or 7 unidentified objects racing overhead, heading towards the direction of Greeny Mountain. And there were other witnesses. Brian Norton started calling various Air Force bases and airports and could not find any confirmation of these objects. He searched the area himself for several hours, found no evidence of any fire, and he phoned NORAD back to tell them. And he was routed to, strangely, a supervisor from FEMA who said in no uncertain terms to just forget about the incident. And when Sheriff Norton asked about this officer became belligerent and hung up on him. So over the next few days, there was a number of sightings and a number of green balls of light were being observed striking the mountain. And also there was a number of government aircraft, B-52 bombers flying over the site. There was a bunch of black helicopters appearing. People saw more weird blue flares in the area. A lot of sheriffs and deputies were keeping watch, and they observed UFOs themselves. Deputy Mike James, he saw 3 helicopters flying over only 300 feet apart, scouring the area, apparently looking for something. So this was a pretty major event. There were more weird explosions, more black helicopters. Sheriff Brian Norton continued to investigate it because it was clear something was going on. He called NORAD again and asked them, what are all these black helicopters we're seeing up here? And NORAD's response was, quote, "That's confidential information." So Sheriff Brian Norton actually spoke to reporters, and he said, and I quote, "It's strange. I really can't make heads or tails of this." He suspects that something crashed on Greeny Mountain. He thought perhaps it was a cruise missile, but he contacted White Sands, and a spokesman, Jim Eccles, said that they had not lost any cruise missiles and told him, quote, "We know nothing about the source of this phenomenon up in Colorado." But as Sheriff Norton says, something was there. This valley is not known for chopters. We don't have any in the valley. And I'd like to know where these are coming from and what they are doing here. As Norton says, at first we were just thinking it was a downed plane or something. Then the longer it went, the story kept changing. We tried to come up with our own conclusions in this matter, but we didn't have any. We just kind of stood around scratching our heads and looked at the sky. So by the end of January, the sightings stopped, and he called NORAD again, and nobody had any answers. They just gave him the runaround. As Sheriff Norton says, and I quote, "Somebody knows what happened. I think they located it, and now it's over with." But this wasn't over yet. There was more sightings for a few months, actually. Christopher O'Brien investigated this case, and he learned that there were some very disturbing aspects to it. He was able to talk with someone who had a source, quote, close to the NORAD event, and found that in the 2 weeks following this original incident, a newly promoted captain at the base was found in her garage dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. Allegedly, she had committed suicide, but it's certainly a suspicious death because he spoke with another NORAD employee who told him that the captain's death was in fact related to the NORAD event and that 2 other people involved in the case also died under suspicious similar circumstances. And Christopher O'Brien writes, "What could be so secret as to warrant death?" Well, as we have seen with UFO crash retrieval cases, the government or the secret government will sometimes go to extreme lengths to cover it up. Certainly the Roswell craft, people were threatened with death, and there were a few suspicious deaths involved in that case and in other cases. So that is the Greeny Mountain incident. And although there is no direct evidence saying that this was a UFO crash, there's certainly quite a bit of circumstantial evidence pointing towards something very unusual happening. And that's why I gave it case number 5. And now we move to case number 4, which I had to include because this had a devastating impact on the UFO field. The Condon Committee was commissioned after a wave of sightings over Dexter, Michigan, which caused a lot of publicity, a lot of strife between the Air Force and the public. And it appeared that the Air Force wanted to get out of the UFO business. So they gave the Condon Committee what amounts to about $4 million in, accounting for inflation, to study UFOs officially. And they used exclusively reports from Project Blue Book. This commission was headed by Edward Condon, who was chosen because of his eminent position as a scientist and his, quote, lack of any stated position on UFOs. Also heading the project was Robert Lowe. So Edward Condon was supposed to be impartial. It turned out he was anything but. He was actually a very strong skeptic of UFOs. And this investigation was supposed to be a 2-year investigation. It ended up taking a little bit longer. And from the very beginning, its objectivity was questioned when a memo was leaked out during the investigation in which Robert Lowe and Edward Condon revealed that they were extremely skeptical of the subject. And there's a direct quote saying, "My attitude right now is that there's nothing to it, but I'm not supposed to reach that conclusion for another year." And Condon himself said, "The trick would be, I think, to describe the project so that to the public, it would appear to be a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having almost zero expectation of finding a saucer." So this was a disaster from the beginning. In fact, a bunch of people who were actually part of the study actually walked off or were fired from the actual project. And the Condon Committee actually concluded in their book that there is nothing to the UFO phenomena. As they said, and I quote, "Nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record as it is available to us leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified." And they wrote that we have no evidence of secrecy concerning UFO reports. That is completely disingenuous. They knew from the very beginning that UFOs were real. And we're spending our tax dollars, spending an enormous amount of time and effort to cover this up and make witnesses look like fools. And to really put the nail in the coffin, they wrote in the Condon Committee report, and I'm quoting, "A related problem to which we wish to direct public attention is the miseducation in our schools, which arises from the fact that many children are being allowed, if not actively encouraged, to devote their science study time to the reading of UFO books and magazine articles. Therefore, we strongly recommend that teachers refrain from giving students credit for schoolwork based on their reading of the presently available UFO books and magazine articles." And that made me laugh when I read that. So not surprisingly, the Condon Committee's results came under immediate attack by many prominent people. The American Institute of Astronautics and Aeronautics formed a committee actually to study the results. And after a year, they rejected Condon's conclusions, stating, and I quote, "We find it difficult to ignore the small residue of well-documented but unexplainable cases that form the hard core of the UFO controversy." Many UFO researchers also rejected it, including Stanton Friedman, a very prominent UFO researcher. J. Allen Hynek, he pointed out that fully 30% of the sightings still remained unidentified. John Fuller, author of The Incident at Exeter and the book about Betty and Barney Hill's encounter, The Interrupted Journey, He called it, quote, a flying saucer fiasco. Dr. James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist and one of the first scientists to take the UFO subject seriously, he wrote, in all, I believe the contents of the Condon Committee failed dismally to support the strong negative recommendations which Condon has presented in his own summary analysis. And John Northrop of Northrop Aircraft and Lockheed called the committee, quote, one of the most deliberate cover-ups ever perpetrated on the public. Look magazine wrote an article about this, and this got the attention of Congress. And Congressman Edward Roosh read this article in Look magazine and said that the story in Look raises grave doubts as to the scientific profundity of the project. I am recommending that we launch a congressional investigation. Congressman William Bates also agreed and said, I think it would be good to get another group of scientists to take a look at this matter so we can be more certain of the decision which are being made. So despite all of this, the Condon Committee reached negative conclusions and Project Blue Book was closed down shortly later. This did lead to a congressional investigation in which James McDonald and others testified before Congress. And unfortunately, this did cause a lot of people to take a negative viewpoint of UFOs. I've talked to many witnesses myself who did not believe in UFOs for years because of the results of the Condon Committee. So this had a devastating impact, I think, on how people viewed UFOs and really caused untold damage and led to a lot of ridicule and disbelief on this subject. While at very high levels of government, they knew full well that this was absolutely a real phenomenon. So that's why I gave it the number 4 case on this list. One of the guys, David R. Saunders, who was actually part of this committee, wrote a book absolutely lambasting this study and saying exactly what happened with this project. So for case number 3, I chose what is the first widely publicized animal mutilation case, as far as I know. And this is the mutilation of Lady the horse. Most of the earlier reports called it Snippy. That turns out to be a mistake. Snippy was Lady's son. The actual horse's name was was Lady. And this case occurred on September 8th, 1967, in a ranch very near Mount Blanca and the Great Sand Dunes. The owners of the horse were Burl and Nellie Lewis, but they kept their horse on a ranch owned by Harry King. And according to Harry King, he often saw UFOs near his ranch, which was located right here near the Great Sand Dunes. And immediately prior to this incident, he saw UFOs, very low level. In fact, he saw a craft about 150 feet above him and 150 feet away from his car. The object stopped, or he stopped his car and the object stopped, and it followed him for a mile before suddenly zooming off. And it was not longer after that, on the morning of September 8th, 1967, that he discovered one of the horses that he had on his ranch. Lady was missing. And he went to search for Lady and found her. There were no tracks around her. He found her original tracks with a bunch of other horses who had apparently been spooked. This small group of horses was running together at high speed, and Lady's tracks veered away from the group and then suddenly ended. And this was just a few hundred yards away from where they actually found her body. And like many of these animal mutilation cases, the flesh had been stripped from her head. The sex organs had been cored out. There was no blood. There was some very unusual things about this case. About 40 feet away, there was a smashed bush. There were 8 strange circular depressions on the ground. Many strange things about this particular sighting. You can see Nellie and Burl Lewis here on the right and other investigators. Yeah, no tracks were found surrounding this incident and became very widely publicized. They called in police investigators who were skeptical and did not want to get involved. But one guy, Dwayne Martin from the Forestry Service, agreed to investigate, and he brought a Geiger counter and confirmed that radiation levels in this area were well beyond normal. This did catch the attention of reporters who called the horse Snippy and tried to explain away this sighting, but were unable to do so. This account appeared in many UFO books. And at some point, a researcher by the name of Dr. John Altshuler came in. He was a professor of medicine and pathology at the University of Colorado Health Sciences. And he went to investigate the carcass and was shocked by the wounds. And examining the edges, he concluded that the cuts had been done by some type of surgical cauterizing blade. And it was years later when lasers became available to the public for surgery, and he was struck by the similarity of these wounds. And he says, and I'm quoting, "Most amazing was the lack of blood. I have done hundreds of autopsies. You can't cut into a body without getting some blood, but there was no blood on the skin or on the ground, no blood anywhere. That impressed me the most. How do you get the heart out without any blood?" So he knew that there was a bunch of UFO sightings in this area, and so he decided to stay up late and investigate himself. And around 2 to 3 a.m., he was out by the Great Sand Dunes when he saw UFOs. As he says, and I quote, "I saw 3 very bright white lights moving together slowly below the Sangre de Cristo mountaintops. At one point, I thought they were coming towards me because they got bigger. Then suddenly they shot up and disappeared." As he says, "I was unbelievably frightened. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I was so afraid I would be discovered, discredited, fired, no longer would have any credibility in the medical community. My experience in 1967 was so overwhelming to me, I denied the experience to everyone, even to myself." And I think one of the reasons for that was because he actually had missing time and later underwent regressive hypnosis and recalled being taken on board a UFO. As he says, they were not the typical kind of gray creatures. They were different. I don't know if that's a figment of my imagination or not. I don't know. They had huge heads, huge, with a very small body. The head had 4 definite wrinkles on the forehead. The eyes were wide open, literally. So this pushed Dr. Altshuler into the forefront of the cattle mutilation phenomena. In my book, I included a whole chapter on the cattle mutilations, a whole section, because Colorado is one of the hardest hit states in the United States, Colorado and New Mexico. There's a lot of controversy about the cattle mutilations and the other animal mutilations. There does appear to be government involvement. Some think it is actually solely government. Many of these mutilations have occurred where there are areas of nuclear fallout. So it could be that the ETs are studying the radiation from this. Could be they are harvesting genetic material because there are long strands of cattle DNA that are basically identical to humans. But other researchers do feel that this could be absolutely a government thing. So I don't know, it's hard to say. I'm not really an expert on the cattle mutilations. Christopher O'Brien has really dug deep into this, but this is something that's caused great concern at very high levels of government. There's been a lot of investigations into this. This has devastated the many ranchers who've had to deal with this. And that's why I wanted to include it in this list. I gave it the number 3 case because this has been such a devastating, had such a devastating impact on the cattle industry in Colorado and is still ongoing. All right, now we get to the number 2 case. And the case I chose for number 2, I wonder if any of you can guess. I chose the, oops, sorry about this. Here's some more newspaper articles about the Snippy case. There's the actual skeleton of Snippy the horse. There was a big fight over who would get to keep the skeleton, but it's still on display as far as I know. You can go visit it. But the case I chose for number 2 is the San Luis Valley UFO hotspot. Every state that I've investigated has an area that is particularly prone to UFO sightings. For example, Arizona, it's Sedona. For California, it's the Santa Monica Mountains, the Santa Catalina Channel. And for Colorado, it appears to be the San Luis Valley. We really owe a lot of kudos to Christopher O'Brien for investigating and writing about the many sightings which have occurred here. He moved into the San Luis Valley in July of 1989. He was a musician and construction worker, but started having sightings himself and went to a party where he heard people talking about UFOs, found out this was a hot spot, and sort of got dragged into the UFO field involuntarily around the same time I did, and really began investigating, and soon uncovered many, many encounters involving a wide variety of objects, anomalous lights, disc-shaped craft, triangles, boomerangs, fleets of objects, a bunch of landings, and of course, abductions, people being chased by UFOs in their cars, car lift cases where UFOs swoop down and lift cars up into the sky, much like that case in Longmont I mentioned earlier, animal mutilation cases. So yeah, there's an enormous amount of activity in this particular area. It stretches back over 100 years. In fact, there are Native American oral traditions about UFO sightings in this area and ant people within those sand dunes, the Great Sand Dunes. So for some reason, this area is very prone to UFO sightings. And of course, has become very well publicized because of that. One of the really interesting things I find about the San Luis Valley, I went there myself, by the way, with Stephen Greer on one of his UFO CE5 workshops, at which time he did call down UFOs. So I have seen a number of UFOs with Stephen Greer. He came to here in LA and called down UFOs as well. So yeah, there's something about this area which is very conducive to UFO sightings. One of my favorite stories coming out of this is the UFO Watchtower, which was founded by Judy Messeline. She kept having people camping on her land, which is near Hooper, in the South San Luis Valley. And she became frustrated by it and finally decided if you can't beat them, join them. And she asked the city if she could build a UFO watchtower, and she got approval, and she built what I believe to be one of the first UFO watchtowers in the United States. And it was immediately very popular, attracting dozens of visitors, and continues to be very popular. And she has cataloged many hundreds of sightings from her UFO watchtower, and had sightings almost immediately after building this tower. I haven't been there yet, but it's definitely on my bucket list. And she's talked to many, many people who've not only had sightings, but abductions as well. So I think it's an important step. We should have more UFO watchtowers all across the US, and especially in these UFO hotspots. but she recorded sightings, dozens in 2001, throughout 2002, throughout 2003. As far as I know, it is still opened. And yeah, it's definitely something, I think if you want to see a UFO, that would be a good place to go. They've had people actually call down UFOs using powerful flashlights on this watchtower. So that's why I gave it the #2 spot. The San Luis Valley is a really good place to go if you want to see UFOs. All right, and now I get to the #1 case, and I'm thinking some of you can guess which one this is.
How do you turn off TV?
Somebody needs to mute their microphone, please. All right, so now we get to the #1 case, which I chose, the Salida sightings of August 27, 1995. And this occurred in the town of Salida, Colorado. Beautiful place. And on that morning, August 27th, 1995, Brandy Edwards, who was 6 years old, Tim Edwards' daughter, was standing next to her father, who was the owner of a cafe in Salida. And she kept telling her dad, look, there's something in the sky. And he ignored her, he was working, but she kept insisting to look up. And finally he did. He looked up and was absolutely shocked. There was a huge, gigantic, silver-colored, cigar-shaped craft. And Tim Edwards was utterly shocked at what he was seeing. As he said, the instant he saw this, and I quote, "They put some feelings in me I have never had before. When I was looking at the main craft, I got like an electrical impulse through my body. It was very important for the world to know the truth. Now I'm convinced we're not alone." So I think that this craft came down purposefully in sort of, again, a publicity stunt. And we're doing, have an agenda to make themselves known. And we're using Tim Edwards as sort of a vehicle for this. Tim Edwards grabbed his video camera and recorded almost 10 minutes of videotape while he, his wife, and his daughter watched this object. And to Tim, it appeared to be a very large cylindrical shaped object glowing with a pulsating light, which is really exactly what this footage shows. However, his wife and his daughter were watching it through binoculars, and they not only saw this craft, which they described as being more disc-shaped with colored lights, they saw other smaller craft darting around it. So this really affected Tim Edwards profoundly. He says, "I felt deeply at the time that I was witnessing something of great scientific and historic importance to the world. I believe that the August 27th craft was sending a message to the world and wanted to be photographed, that its appearance was somehow just the beginning of more to come, and that I was really fortunate to be a part of it." So he released his footage to the media, and of course it caused a huge explosion of interest. Newspaper journalists from across the world converged to interview him, and his footage appeared on a number of news stations and on television programs such as Encounters and Sightings. And for Tim Edwards, the impact couldn't have been greater. As he says, for the first 3 weeks, I was an emotional wreck. Everything seemed so trivial. My family couldn't understand my obsession with it. It wasn't long after this that he got confirmation from a number of other people who were seeing UFOs at the time. Many other people who actually had seen this thing. In fact, there was observers at Fisk Planetarium. They received a bunch of calls from people in this area who had seen UFOs. What is also very interesting is that this footage was researched by a number of photographic experts who specialize in UFO footage, such as Jim Diletteso. And Diletteso was not able to identify this as anything that he could make sense of, and declared that it was in fact unidentified. And he is not the only researcher who looked at this footage in detail. Also, Bruce Maccabee, very well known for analyzing UFO photos. According to Jim Dilettesso, he says, and I quote, "It is definitely a very large, solid, three-dimensional, possibly cylindrical object at high altitude. We don't know how large it is as of yet, but the object clearly is emitting brilliant white and yellow colored lights and is demonstrating unusually rapid darting movements in the sky. And we have confirmed on the tape the presence of smaller objects coming from it, which confirms the witnesses' visual accounts. So further analysis confirmed that this object was hovering at about 60,000 feet and moving at times in excess of 10,000 miles per hour." So this turned out to be a really landmark case, and is probably among the best UFO footage to date that we've received. It has never been debunked, and no evidence of a hoax, and is, I think, probably the best footage coming out of Colorado. So that's why I gave it the #1 spot. It's certainly not the only UFO photographs coming out of Colorado. Here I'd like to share, towards the tail end of this presentation, some other photographs that have come out of Colorado. This was taken on August 8th, 2003. I obviously cannot vouch for these particular photographs, as I don't believe they were analyzed, but they were reported to MUFON and appear to show very unusual objects. Here's a case which took over a graveyard, took place over a graveyard in Alt, Colorado. I find that interesting because I actually did a study of UFOs hovering over graveyards, which, like prisons, is a thing that actually attracts UFOs. No kidding. I mean, this is actually a thing. There are cases from J. Allen Hynek, from Raymond Fowler, from many leading UFO researchers in which UFOs hover over graveyards. And it seems to be true in this case, and the witnesses were actually able to capture a photograph as well as some unusual orbs. So yeah, there's been a number of really intriguing photographs taken. I love photographic evidence, but these days it's not as good as it used to be, unless the witness is actually willing to stand behind it, because UFO photographs are now very easy to fake with Photoshop and other, programs. But many objects have been photographed. Here's an interesting photograph which the witness took. He saw this weird device being extended from an object, and he took the photograph, at which point the objects quickly darted away. Here's another interesting photograph. The person was actually taking a picture of the sunset, did not see any UFO when they were taking the picture, and only upon developing the picture noticed this object, which has a clearly definite hard, looks like a metallic object with hard edges. Many photographs of UFOs do not seem to be visible to the naked eye when the photograph is being taken. So that's certainly true in this case. Here's another interesting UFO photograph taken over Greeley. And it's hard to see in the original photograph in the upper right corner, but there's a enlargement to the right here where you can see that this is clearly a sort of typical metallic flying saucer. So definitely there have been some very interesting photographs. And now I just want to mention a few other cases, since I have a couple of minutes left, about some cases that didn't make my top 20 list, but I really wanted to include them because they're so interesting. There was one case which occurred on April 7th, 1966. This was in Littleton, Colorado, when a group of teenagers were camping out at the park in Littleton, Colorado, when they heard strange noises overhead and ran out of this little cabin they were in and saw a humanoid standing on top. at which point it jumped off and disappeared. They were freaked out. They ran into their car. They saw a UFO. Their car engine failed, and they went at some point, the engine was sputtering and the headlights dimming, and they drove off and reported their sighting to the chief of police, John C. McIver, who's pictured here. And he was very impressed by the teenagers' testimony because they were very emotional about it and clearly not lying. I like this case because it was a multi-witness case involving a humanoid, which is somewhat rare. Another case I wanted to include, but just didn't make the list, was a case that occurred on June 8th, 2005, in which a MUFON field investigator, actually the Australian director for MUFON, Glennis McKay, was visiting friends in Golden, Colorado, when someone pointed out what they thought at first was a large bird hovering overhead, but then it came closer and started darting around, and at one point it became very clear to them that this was not a bird. It passed over a grove in ponderosa pines and then turned towards them. And at this point, it started flashing lights. As Glennis McKay said, this object was flashing a blue light, and on turning toward us was silver and round and appeared to be landing on a clear grass area between the trees across the valley. It then climbed up to eye level and started to fly towards us. So 5 people watched this object as it followed the contour of the hills, then turned, flew for a short distance, and took off at high speed towards Denver. One of the witnesses did snap 2 pictures, which I was not able to view. But as Glennis McKay says, and I quote, "This really made our trip to the USA a pretty exciting one, as our host and hostess had never seen a UFO or even believed in them up until this time." So a very interesting case for sure. And one final case I also like to talk about because it's just so bizarre and extensive, and I wish I had more information about it. This appeared in where I found it was in one of Timothy Good's excellent books. Timothy Good is one of my favorite researchers. I do know that this case was investigated by Dr. Leo Sprinkle and a number of other researchers. And this occurred at a Rocky Mountain ranch. I'm not sure where it is, but it's not too far, I believe, from Cheyenne Mountain Complex. And this was throughout the mid-1970s when the owner of the ranch started seeing UFOs, started having some of his cattle mutilated, started having Bigfoot sightings. This was ongoing. They had one instance where there's Bigfoot ran right across their property. UFOs were getting very close overhead. They had once some weird electromagnetic effects. Their stereo went on and actually talked in a voice, warning them to leave the matter alone. So it appears that the UFO is talking through the stereo, which sounds crazy, but I have to say that this is not unique. This happened to Whitley Strieber. This happens to a number of UFO witnesses I've talked to who have received unusual phone calls. A number of people have talked about messages coming through their radio. So this is definitely a thing. UFOs are known for affecting electromagnetic instruments. It's a very extensive case, and I don't want to get too into it, but it sort of all culminated in one encounter where the ranch owner was walking around his property and came upon a landed UFO. And at first he saw figures around him and thought they might be normal humans, but it became pretty clear that they weren't, because they looked very unusual, although human looking, were wearing jumpsuits and had large eyes and very pale skin, were very beautiful looking. And he proceeded to have a conversation with them. And what's really interesting is while he was talking to them, there was a Bigfoot standing right nearby and was being apparently controlled by these human-looking figures who basically told him that they won't bother him if he doesn't bother them. So it's a very interesting case, to say the least, and would certainly love to hear more about it. But that is basically my lecture for today. I really want to thank you guys for listening. There were many other cases I really wanted to talk about, but those are the top 20 that I feel are probably some of the most famous or unique or most credible or have something really important to contribute to our understanding of the UFO phenomena. And that's why I included them in this lecture. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm definitely happy to answer any questions you might have. And yeah, thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Preston. I commend you so much for the amount of research that you have done, not only in the state of Colorado, but in this field altogether. It's super impressive. And I thought your presentation was amazing. And I do have a couple questions. First, I'd like to comment, the last case that you mentioned, you and I will have to definitely have lunch or dinner out in Laughlin, because I have a personal connection to that ranch. It was owned by our family friends of ours, and I have so much I can share with you about that, including the exact location of the ranch and my own experiences out on that property and whatnot. So I'm anxious to talk to you about that property. So thank you for including that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. One of my favorite things too that you talked about is that 1931 humanoid case with the transparent craft. I found that really super interesting for obvious reasons, because I think they connect to some of that information out on that ranch all those decades later. Another thing I thought was fascinating that I've never heard before is the UFOs over prisons. So much to talk to you more about in the future. I just find all this so fascinating, and yeah, really, really crazy. And I'm going to start off questions for all you folks here. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to try something different for asking questions. What I would like to do is, at the bottom of your Zoom screens is a little icon that says reactions with a little smiley face. If you click on that at the bottom, it says you can raise your hand. So if you guys have a question for Preston, will you please just raise your hand? And when I call on you, then you can unmute your mics and ask the questions personally. I just want to try it this way instead of me reading all the questions. So let's give that a shot. And I'm going to start out with a question for Preston. You had mentioned some of the cases had like low pitch humming noises. And as an investigator, this is something I try to investigate. Did you notice through your research a change in the phenomenon through the decades?
I wonder about that, because no, I'm going to say no. What really intrigues me is the airship wave of the 1890s and 1900s, which definitely was different. But I think from like 1940s onwards, we're still seeing classic saucer shaped. I think there were a lot more of the classic saucer shape back then, and we started to see a lot more different shapes. So I will say that. I certainly do see, spherical shapes, boomerang shapes, manta ray shapes, rectangles, all kinds of shapes, which I find very intriguing and hard to categorize. A number of people have asked me, can you match these shapes to the actual type of ETs? No, I can't. I also found intriguing the shapes of like the triangle UFOs. There's a lot of talk now about like these triangle UFOs are government. And so I thought, that's interesting. And I looked into my files, and I have to tell you, I found very few cases involving your classic triangle case. Most of them were like boomerang or slightly different. So that might be an unusual development. But another people have talked to me like, have abductions stopped? Or have they gone down? I'm going to say no, because I still get current cases involving, missing time abductions. I know a guy in England right now who's dealing with that. So for the most part, no. The only change I see is sort of a steady escalation of activity. And this could be because the subject is being pushed into the mainstream and people are now more comfortable reporting it. Or this could be an actual escalation of reports. But according to NUFORC and MUFON, they continue to get more and more reports each year. And we have these waves of sightings over, city centers like Phoenix or Gulf Breeze or the Hudson Valley Wave. I think this is a publicity campaign on the part of the ETs, and we're moving towards open official disclosure. So I think there will be big changes coming up, and maybe very soon. So we'll see.
Right. Yeah, we'll see what happens with the big June announcement. Okay, so question here from, sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, but Tamira, you would like to?
Sure, yeah, no, it's Tamara, but I've heard all versions of it. So I just had a quick question. You had mentioned the boomerang shaped craft, and I have a couple cases recently with that. Have you done any analysis on the boomerang / V-shaped or chevron shaped craft? And do you see like a trend or a pattern with those?
No, I haven't done any specific analysis of it. I can say I do get a number of reports of them and have for a very long time, including people who've been taken on board them. So I'm very much convinced that they aren't government, that's for sure. One of my favorite cases involving a boomerang-shaped object took place in 1978 over what was then the tallest building in San Diego, where the guy interviewed, Rick Liebert, was a special effects expert and set up an argon laser for a radio station as a publicity stunt to sort of advertise a radio station. And they had no sooner set it up and set this laser off, and it was going off, when these two boomerang-shaped objects came swooping down. One was much higher, but one was very low over the building, and had clearly come to investigate the laser and was just maybe 50 feet up, made a very low buzzing sound, was a flat black color. That's something I've heard from a number of these boomerang cases, and had big green lights going off of each V, which is also something I've heard. So that's sort of your typical boomerang case. But I haven't done any sort of statistical analysis of them, but definitely run into these types of cases fairly frequently.
That's great, thank you.
Barry, if you'd like to ask a question.
Sure. Preston, I want to ask you, are you aware of any other states that have done anything similar to what happened in November 2008 with Jeff Peckman's ordinance and trying to create a committee in Colorado to investigate UFOs? Are you aware of any other states that have done something similar?
No, I'm not. Gosh, I seem to remember there was something. I don't remember which state it was. But as far as I know, that's unique, and which saddens me, because I think it's an important step, and we do need to start officially investigating this, on multiple levels, because our own government is clearly taking this very seriously at high levels, and is not telling us. There's, as far as I know, no open official government UFO study group. They're all secret. So I think that's changing with these recent Pentagon disclosures, and pilots being allowed to discuss it, and the Navy, releasing this Tic Tac footage and all of this. But yes, we need to start looking at this from a municipal level, city governments, and so on, because this is a very important subject. I think it has the potential to change the world. I mean, if we truly do have this technology from UFO crash retrievals, and I think the evidence for that is very compelling. It's not just Roswell. Every state that I've investigated has UFO crashes. Every state I've written about, I should say. So I think they're probably numbering in the hundreds, which, according to the people who specialize in UFO crash retrieval, like Bob Wood, yes, there are many hundreds of UFO crashes. I think we have this technology. It's time it was released. We don't need to rely on the fossil fuels. If we could release this technology, we could solve the environmental crisis, the economic crisis, the energy crisis, all in one fell swoop. So that's why I think the subject is really important. That's why I continue to investigate it, and why I think there should be official study groups. And yeah, I wish there were more, but as far as I know, there aren't any.
Do you think that if we actually do get a congressional release of information in June, the 180-day mark, is it going to be the usual spin? Or do you think there's going to be, in your opinion, anything that outside of what, I guess everybody's expectations might be?
No, I don't think it's going to be anything earth-shaking. I'm really pleased that there is a study taking place or a disclosure, but I honestly think our government has such a long history of lying about this subject of this sort of thing that I don't trust them. I really don't. And I hate to say that, but we'll see what comes forth with this disclosure. But I think their hand is being forced. I think it's sort of like the civil rights movement. They have to do it because there's so much pressure on all sides, from the UFOs themselves, from investigators, from contactees. I think if they don't disclose, they're going to lose all credibility. They're going to lose control of this subject, and that's why they're doing it. And I imagine they're going to put a spin on it. But we will see. I'm not really an expert on the government cover-up, but I'm very, very pleased that there is movement, at least, because there's been no movement for since I got involved in this field. There's been no official word at all. So now there is, and I'm very curious to see how this all rolls out. And I hope it's full on disclosure, but I don't think they're going to show us anything more than perhaps some photos or pieces of metal, which is disingenuous because they've got the craft, they've got the alien bodies. And that's what I want to see. I want to see the Roswell craft in a museum. And until we do, as far as I'm concerned, disclosure hasn't taken place.
Yeah, we'll get as much information as the government wants us to have.
Yeah.
So thanks, Preston.
iPhone, I will get to your message in a minute. Blue Moon, did you want to read this or would you like me to read it? You can unmute your mic if you would like to ask this question.
Oh, hi, Katie. Sure. I think it's only because Preston mentioned about the radio and messages coming through. And when I was younger, I'm not going to go into this, it's a really scary one for me, but Albert K. Bender wrote a book. I can't remember, Flying Saucers and the Tree Man, but he had experiences with the Men in Black. And not only did he have messages come through the radio, but he had visitations from them. And the radio would be on, and there's this connection with the radio, which was kind of interesting. And apparently they were aliens, and they basically, they had the red eyes, and they had taken them down there. And the thing that needs credence to this kind of like crazy story is that this was back in '61 that he published his book, and he was so ahead of his time talking about the undersea bases, that's where they were, the water that used to go missing from lakes and reservoirs. They were using it to take something, to extract something out of it. Angel's hair was a byproduct of that. And he just had a lot of things that, now we accept as kind of normal that he was putting out there back in the 60s, early 60s. So I kind of always been open to him. And plus he had an interesting incident happen. He was out of New Haven, Connecticut. And this was just separate. I had read it in UFO magazine and saw the pictures, but a green fireball had gone through a billboard. They did some analysis of some residue, found some unknowns. And in his book, he said that basically, and this was, I didn't know was connected, that was a sign that he had asked if he was really experiencing this thing that they had done to him. And since he was in New Haven, that seemed to make sense. And I never hear anybody talk about Albert K. Bender. And I was just wondering if Preston had come across that because of the connection with the radio stuff. And I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I've read that book. They knew too much about flying saucers. And yeah, well, like I mentioned, I have gotten cases involving weird electromagnetic effects. I did a study of cases of people who've received bizarre phone calls because I started getting cases of that where people would receive phone calls and there would be mechanical voices talking to them claiming to be from UFOs.
Right.
One case that comes to mind was from upstate New York involving an abductee. He was having all kinds of missing time. He would receive unusual calls every Wednesday. And I know how this must sound, but this happened to Betty Andreasen. There's a number of cases. This happened to Bud Hopkins' star client, Debbie Jordan, I believe was the pseudonym she used, the lady from Intruders.
Do you have any opinion on Albert K. Bender? What do you think about him?
I think he was, a good researcher. probably was threatened. I don't get personally a lot of Men in Black cases. I've had a few. I did once get a call from some guy who claimed to be within government and had a top secret clearance and did threaten me, sort of in a roundabout way. I don't have any strong opinions on Albert K. Bender one way or the other than I did find his book very interesting.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Do you mind, Preston, if I speak to the electronic voices for 1 second?
Yeah,
My
sure.
mother, my older sister, my older sister and I were on the ranch in Elbert County. The adults were playing a board game in the front room, and my sister and I were upstairs with the 3 older boys on the ranch out in, this was 1976. I was 11 years old, and a big bright white light came through the front window, and all the power in the house went out. It was completely dark. And as many of you know, when the power goes out, especially when you're a kid, you're kind of like, oh my God, you're freaking out. And at that time is when this electronic voice came out of the radio and the power was off. So how this was happening, we have no idea. And in this very, very mechanical voice, I actually recreated it for a presentation I did. And it was the first time my older sister had heard it. And she had like a PTSD reaction to hearing this voice. But it was basically, your friends will be warned not to talk about us. And for those 3 years of our lives, from 1975 to 1978, we were threatened not to talk about that activity out in the ranch. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because that was all very traumatic. It was very eerie. It was scary. It was terrifying. I never slept alone, slept with lights on, shadow figures in the room, on and on and on. But that definitely happened. And I was there in the house when that electronic voice came through. So I don't know how that happens or what that's about, but that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, to try and find those answers. So I just wanted to speak since you asked specifically about that. So thank you for letting me do that.
Yeah.
iPhone. Yeah. iPhone, you had a question for Preston? You can unmute your mic. They have their hand up. I'm not sure who the name is. Oh, there we go. Okay. It just says iPhone.
Probably, I don't know why it does that. I'm sorry.
Okay, there you are.
It's Gary. I'm sorry.
Gary.
I was late. I was having some internet trouble with the link getting in. I figured it out now. I'm sorry.
No sweat.
Now I had several questions, but the first one was these experiencers or abductees that when they get into this sort of thing, is it because is it generational? Is it something genetic? Have they identified something about them that they just keep coming back for that same generation of people, or it doesn't just happen to anyone, you know?
Oh yeah, I've actually looked into this because I was very curious, because it's my files evenly divided between men and women. Cases come from all across the world. I don't think it's blood type, which has been, certainly a hot button topic. I couldn't find any relation to, education or religion or political party or race or really anything. I did find that at least half the cases do seem to be generational. So that's absolutely a factor, and probably even more than 50%, because not everyone knows if their parents or their grandparents have seen UFOs or had encounters, but that turns up quite a bit. If someone is being taken on board, chances are very likely this is going on within their family, to parents or aunts or grandparents or their people's children. So yes to that. But other than that, the only other pattern I could find, and this tripped me out, I kind of couldn't believe it, and I really started looking into it deeper, because sometimes it's a one-off. Sometimes people will just have one experience. But one pattern I did find was a person's job, their employment, their vocation. And by that, I mean people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity seem to have a greater likelihood of being contacted. And by that, I mean social workers, environmentalists, doctors, teachers, inventors, artists, entertainers. I mean, there's a long list of musicians who've had contact. It's not just John Lennon, who is, someone who's super influential in society. So to me, that speaks towards the ET agenda of sort of announcing their presence and contacting people who are trying to save our planet and raise people's consciousness, which is really one of their main agendas. When someone's taken on board, yeah, they're physically examined, but they're also given warnings about nuclear proliferation, pollution, our warlike ways, the need to get off of fossil fuels. There's a whole strong spiritual component to onboard encounters. So that is another pattern I've noticed, but otherwise it often seems to be somewhat random. Perhaps if you live in a UFO hotspot, that increases your chances. Or if you're friends with a contactee, that also increases your chances. Or if you investigate this subject, they will come for you too.
Oh boy.
Yeah, there are definitely some patterns, but
okay,
it seems to be random.
Yeah, just a couple more quick things. These things we've been seeing released from the Navy on the news, do you think we're going to hear any more about this?
Oh yeah, I'm certain we will. Trying to cover up UFOs is a lost cause. It's like trying to dry the ocean with paper towels or block the sun. I mean, it can't be done. The UFO phenomena is so widespread that it's far more ubiquitous, far more widespread than the government's ability to cover it up. So this will explode into the mainstream, whether the governments want it to or not. And that's why I think they are taking steps to try to put a spin on this and handle it as best they can. We're going to see more steps towards disclosure for sure. And once we have full disclosure, I think that's when we'll have open official contact, if not before that.
Oh, just one last quick thing. Do you think with these mystery schools like Rosicrucians, Masonic, and everything, that there's any connection there?
Possibly. The UFO phenomena we know has been around for millennia. I mean, we've got evidence of that from Egyptian hieroglyphs, petroglyphs, medieval wood carvings, Renaissance paintings, and so on, which these so-called secret schools have been around for a very long time. I imagine that they're aware of what's going on. I'm not really an expert in that area, so it's hard for me to speak to that question in any real detail.
Okay.
But I would imagine that they're aware of it, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Joe? Thank you. Joe, do you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you guys for all you do. This is a curiosity for me. So with the series Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, what do we make of that, since we know that the History Channel is like a mouthpiece for the government's company line? And so what does it mean that they're doing this, long running alien series? And also, what, maybe similarly, what do we think about Fox covering aliens more than anyone else, with Fox being, a propaganda channel?
Yeah, I wonder about this myself. I've been on television a number of times on quite a few programs, actually, and have not always been pleased. I'm not going to name the specific programs, but I have been made to look like an idiot on a few of them. One actually handed me my questions and then handed me my answers. I'm like, what? It's scripted, and I've tried. I'm not pleased with a lot of the times of how I've been portrayed on TV. So I think there is this very strong bias on this subject, and they are trying to spin it in various ways. But again, UFOs is becoming very popular. This is the second most popular subject on the internet. There's just no way to stop this flood of reports. We are not alone in this universe. We never have been. And this lie that has been perpetrated over us has completely fallen apart. The cover-up has been a disastrous failure. And now that we've had so many whistleblowers coming out of the woodwork, the governments are losing complete credibility. So that's what I think they're trying to do, is control this subject as best as they can. and possibly even put a negative spin on this subject, which I don't buy for a second. I don't think UFOs are dangerous to humanity. I think for the most part, it's a benevolent phenomena. I'm not going to say they're all our space brothers, so to speak. But if you look at it objectively, I'm very encouraged by what happens when people are contacted or taken on board. I don't find any compelling evidence for UFO hostility. Some people do have negative encounters, absolutely are traumatized. So there is a bell curve of encounters, but many are very positive. And I think if they wanted to take over our planet, they could have long ago. And what I don't find is what I would call outright sadism or torture when people are taken on board. Again, not to say that people don't have negative encounters. It's a wide, wide universe. But I'm personally not afraid of UFOs. I think that the time is coming. I think their agenda is to have open official contact, and that's what's freaking the government out because it will destroy their power structure. And that's why I think they're probably going to try to put a negative spin, or have been putting a negative spin on this phenomena for a long time. The media is very fear-based, and we'll see how this disclosure rolls out. But what I'm very curious to see is what happens when all the contactees start coming forward and say, hey, I'm being taken on board, and why aren't you doing anything about that? So yeah, it's hard for me to speak to the whole government cover-up. It's not really my area of expertise. I've talked to some whistleblowers and stuff about this, and people at fairly high levels of government. But I'm very interested to see how it all rolls out.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting question, that when people ask you whether it's positive or negative, good, evil, that's such a loaded question, because, you know, in so many cases, even with Travis Walton, where it kind of, you know, his feeling about that has changed, as has mine, when, you know, the Elbert County phenomenon was quite terrifying and scary. But now as an adult, everything seems to be really positive and good. So it's really interesting how that is. Jeff, did you have a question?
Yes, Preston, are you familiar with physicist Kevin Newth?
Somewhat, yeah. Part of the UAP project. Gosh, what is it called? I forget the expedition. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I found a very good interview with him, and I'm going to be putting it up on our COMUFON YouTube channel.
Oh, excellent.
So I found some of his stuff. I found it very enlightening. And for someone that's been following this since the 70s, finding something enlightening is unusual.
Yeah, this subject is finally getting some real attention. I'm very excited about it.
Okay, any more questions out there?
I got one. I'm just, Preston, it's Barry again. What are you working on now? Are you writing? Are you looking to, are you coming out with another book?
Yeah, actually, I just came out with one. It's called Wondrous 25 True UFO Encounters, and covers onboard experiences, some face-to-face contact, some really interesting sightings involving telepathic contact, a couple of whistleblower accounts that I've been wanting to publish for some time. So yeah, that was literally just released. I'm super excited about it and working. I've got like 50 books I want to write. I'm not even kidding. I am not
Do
going to
you have a place where people can go and order your books, Preston? Do you have a website or something you'd like to give out?
Oh yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I do have a website. The actual address is prestondennett.weebly.com. If you just, use the search engine on my name, you should be able to find it. That's 2 N's, 2 T's. Got all my books there, excerpts. I'm at, 28 books at this point. And yeah, I got a lot more I want to write. So I'd love to cover all 50 states actually, but that's going to take 100 years. Yeah, I think this is, again, a very important subject. And people who are skeptical, I understand it. I came into this subject very skeptical. So I understand skepticism, but my word to skeptics would be do your homework. I think if you actually take a look at the evidence objectively, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming and conclusive, utterly conclusive. It's not just eyewitness testimony. There are thousands of landing trace cases. There's angel hair. There's medical effects, injuries and healings. There's animal reaction cases. The implant removal cases are the smoking gun. I mean, for someone to deny UFO reality, they don't have a leg to stand on as far as I'm concerned.
What's
Hey,
the
Fred.
next date on your radar?
Excuse me, I didn't quite catch that.
What's the next date if you want to do a UFO over fill in the blank? Radar?
Well, I've covered a lot of the Southwest, so I'm kind of moving north. I've done California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Colorado. And I did New York. So I was kind of picking states that I thought had a real impact on the UFO phenomena. And I've seen a number of other writers and researchers covering other states. So I'm very encouraged by that. I think every state needs to be covered, but I'm looking at, Oregon, perhaps, Washington, Idaho, Utah. I thought about Wyoming, yeah. I thought about Texas, but oof, or Florida. I started looking to that. I'm like, ooh, that would take years because they have, the activity is just exploding. And it would be, each book, I only really get to skim the surface of what's going on. So it's
Preston,
real tough.
Do you have any, do you have a Patreon account?
No, people have asked me this and I've thought about it and I'm still thinking about it, but we'll see, perhaps, yeah, in the future.
Well, we certainly all appreciate all the hard work and research that you do, and putting all this information out to all of us. It's, you, as all of us that are here know, you're just learning all the time. I mean, even Mr. John Schuessler, Mr. Pioneer, I'm sure is learning things all the time. You just never quit learning and discovering new things when it comes to this phenomenon. So certainly we appreciate it. Any last minute questions before we wrap it up and turn everybody loose to enjoy the rest of their weekends? Okay, we have a question here from Matthew.
Has there ever been like a semi-flat UFO that is kind of like an Xbox 360 that kind of makes people's vision go hazy or distorted when they look at it?
Eye reactions is one of the most common reactions when looking at a UFO. What I mostly hear is after images on the retina, this sort of thing. But yes, I have heard things like that where people do have vision problems while trying to look at a UFO. And for that matter, I talked to some people who will see a UFO and everyone around them cannot see it. And this can be extremely disturbing for the witness who thinks they're going crazy. And they see a UFO hovering very low level overhead and their friends right next to them cannot see it. So perhaps that's related to that. And UFOs do have the ability to turn transparent and invisible, which might seem like that's affecting your eyesight when in fact it's just the UFO itself. But yeah, they do have the ability to affect us physiologically. I can't say I've had a case exactly like you're describing, but I have heard similar things for sure.
Yeah.
Preston, I have a question.
Thanks.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
On the order of paranormal, I've had sightings twice in my living space of the watery beings, the ones you can kind of see through. And I've heard about them through the ages. I've also heard about them from David Paulides and Dr. Stephen Greer and others. And where could I learn more about what those are? I'm just curious because they kind of unnerved me when I saw them, but they're there. And I did follow along with the Durango paranormal group for a little while. And as a little kid, I used to see things a lot when I was a little girl. So what's your opinion on the watery, transparent sort of beings?
Well, I've certainly gotten reports of it. I think that's a great idea for a research project for someone to really focus on. There's so much room for research in this phenomena. And it's definitely connected to the paranormal. Most contactees I speak with have a wide variety of paranormal events in their life. Everything from ghost sightings and orbs to precognition and out-of-body experiences and Bigfoot, and all of this is connected. Most of the humanoid reports I get are, I would say, at least 50%, if not more, of grays. I do get praying mantis, human looking, and a wide variety of humanoids, almost exclusively humanoid though. Very few of what you're describing, but it's very hard to categorize. There are many, many cases I get involving entirely unique humanoids. So I couldn't really, I don't have any strong conclusions or information on what you're describing, but you've got me intrigued. That would be another great idea for a book. To focus on exclusively, a certain aspect of the UFO phenomena, which is what I've done in a number of my books. I wrote a book, Schoolyard UFO Encounters, all about UFOs hovering over schools. Just put one out about UFOs hovering over drive-in theaters. And in my Not From Here series, I covered a bunch of very unusual cases, like UFOs over graveyards and prisons and things like that. So that's a great idea for another project, but I really don't have much information on it. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that Dr. Greer called them transdimensionals.
Yeah, these guys can definitely move through dimensions. I still think the extraterrestrial explanation is the one which best fits the evidence. And although they can time travel and although they can move through dimensions, that does not preclude them from being extraterrestrials in the classic sense. And I really, really think that's the explanation which best fits the facts. And if we truly do have crashed saucers and alien bodies, all bets are off. We know what we're dealing with. I think there's probably a wide variety of things we're dealing with here, and they tend to get bumped into one phenomena. So it could be that some of these are interdimensional beings and not ETs in the sense that we would think of it. But I don't think they're demonic. I've looked into the whole demonic thing too. And yeah, demonic hauntings are absolutely real, but I don't think they account for UFOs. Not at all.
That's good. Thank you, Debbie, for your question. Sorry to interrupt. Paul Ogle, driving, did you have a question? I don't know if he does or not. I just wanted to give him the opportunity if he did. Okay, he must not. All right, any last minute questions here? We're coming around 3:30, so going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right, well, thank you again, Preston. Amazing presentation, and we so appreciate you taking the time to share with all of us all your research. So thanks so much, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your weekends. And we will be in touch. Thanks for all being here.